Germans were applying with devastating logic the first principle of successful modern warfare. To strike at the enemy's air bases and deny him their use, urgent steps had to be taken to protect the defences of our aerodromes, and for this purpose the RAF Regiment was formed.
Hello and welcome to our RAF Regiment in the Dhofar Campaign historical podcast series. We join Wing Commander Tim Jones again for episode 2, Improvising and Forward Air Control. I suppose we could move on to some of the patrol actions and some of the stuff you were getting involved with, which, you know, from the accounts we've already had last night, were pretty gritty and pretty serious, and you're suddenly thrown into these situations.
Yeah.
Which you perhaps weren't initially trained for.
Well, you rapidly realised, I'd read a bit about it, I'd caught up on the operational reports, I'd received the intelligence briefings, I knew what I was getting into. Before I went, we were told you will be deployed on active service for a period of at least 6 months. In my case, it was an 11-month tour. And there were never enough troops, and the threat was escalating all the time. So it was actually quite serious stuff. And it wasn't a primitive war. Our enemy were well trained, they were on their home ground, they had sophisticated modern weapons. Every one of them would carry an automatic rifle. We didn't have fully automatic weapons. They all had AK-47s, plus they had medium machine guns and heavy machine guns. The Russian modern one, the Spargan, which is the equivalent of the .5, a very good weapon indeed, and they knew how to use them. They'd been well trained. They also understood camouflage and concealment brilliantly.
Yeah.
And they understood how to read ground and use ground. You could never see them. It was always difficult. And it rapidly became clear to me that it was not an academic exercise to go through the battle drill. You know, observe, sight, fire, dash down, crawl, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Great. However, locating the enemy was difficult. And having located him, winning the firefight was immensely difficult because he wouldn't reveal his hand. He wouldn't fire automatic straight away. So you didn't know he had an automatic weapon. Or all of them had automatic weapons. Therefore, you know, you could easily get caught out, and you had to really use more force than necessary to make sure you had the upper hand before you moved. And that took some doing. You couldn't leave it to the section commander because our section commanders were inexperienced and they wouldn't move without the Brit officer. So you ended up as a company commander with the leading platoon and usually with the leading section so that you could grip the situation, and also we were the only ones who could talk to the jets and to the artillery because they used English on the net and our soldiers didn't speak English. So it was a rude awakening as a young regiment flight lieutenant, because you were doing what JTAGs do today on your own with somebody carrying one of your 3 radios. We were talking Arabic on the forward net and walkie-talkies, English on the artillery net, English to the jets, arranging Kazovac through the helicopters, also in English. And it was a lot going on. Meanwhile, you'd get the cut glass tones of a brigadier on the rear link radio asking for a sitrep.
Well, that still happens.
So what level of training were you given then, if any, for doing the forward air controlling?
Well, fortunately, you could do some local training. Fortunately, when I was in Aden with 48 Squadron, I had gone out with the forward air control training course up to their ranges, and I'd used the time there to persuade them to let me have a go. And I'd learnt the forward air control. I read the notes, I learnt how to do it, I listened to them doing it, and then at the end of the day, I was able to have a go. This was with hunters in ball button ranges in the Radfan. And so I had quite a fair feel for it, and I understood the techniques. So when we did it for real, we had a couple of practice runs in the north before going down to the war. The aeroplanes were not as powerful as the hunters. They were the strike version of the Jet Provost trainer, side-by-side seating, 300 knots, 2 bombs, 16 rockets. It was a good aeroplane, but a small aeroplane with not a big punch. But it was ideal for that time. And so the training was fortunate for me that I'd done forward air control training before leaving. People who hadn't had to learn it on the hoof. And it wasn't that simple because we didn't have proper radios. We had salvaged Sabi beacons from old May West harnesses, cut off the useless flotation bit of it, expose the radio, which was a battery pack in one side and a transmitter receiver on the other, linked by a large thick cable which went round your neck. And then these two bits, when we exposed them and got them, we'd lash together with gaffer tape so they were a single entity, and stick them in a salvaged kidney patch from the 58 pattern webbing, which you'd begged, borrowed or stolen from somewhere, and hooked onto your webbing as an extra bit. But it was improvised, but incredibly efficient. It worked really, really well, and it had the advantage of a switch where you could put a beacon on, which gave your indicator to the aeroplanes, so they weren't going to drop a bomb on you by accident because they could see where you were. And that was particularly important because the maps were pretty useless.
What sort of range were you getting off the Sabis? Could you communicate with the aircraft as they're leaving Salalah? Or
No, nothing like. They were almost line of sight.
Yeah, right.
Really.
Yeah.
But later the VHF radios we got did have longer range and were much better.
And you could communicate to the aircraft with the VHF?
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Not to start with, but eventually, yes.
Yeah.
And you'd end up, you'd have you'd be controlling a jet inbound from Salalah on a proper forward air control mission where you sent him to a space. You gave him his direction of heading, you gave him his speed, and you told him at what point you wanted him to pull up and where to look for the target. You hoped the target was fairly accurate on your inaccurate map.
Yeah. And
you usually marked it with an artillery smoke or mortar smoke. Again, watching that you weren't likely to hit the aeroplane whilst you did it.
Yeah.
And he was more concerned about that than we were. but you quickly got adjusted to it. The pilots are incredibly good. And they came out with us on the ground on ambushes and all sorts of things, so they got a real feel for what we were trying to do and how difficult it was, and they were able to adjust their flying to fit what we were trying to do, which is a really unusual set of circumstances and very helpful.
Yeah.
It was a tight-knit organisation, we were all buddies, and we all knew each other. You'd do anything for each other.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Is that probably similar to the way it is now? A lot of the pilots in JTACs will kind of know each other and...
Yeah, 100%, and it's something I suppose we strive to achieve, particularly with our unit, the LI cell, going to RAF Conisbee Typhoon forces there. Pre-briefs before we go, coming back and doing the post-exercise or post-operation debriefs, constantly learning. Like I say, it builds that rapport, and like I say, everyone's kind of chums and friends and wants to help each other out, so it's definitely a big part of it. And you need that level of, I suppose, friendship on the net as well, don't you? Because it has to be quite...
trust.
Yeah, it's got to be a trust there. You have to be able to trust the JTAC at the ground, be confident in his ability, and likewise with the pilot. So, ultimately he's the expert in the air, and if you know him, know his capabilities, he's going to give you the...
But correct me if I'm wrong, nowadays I think before you do a danger close mission, you have to give your initials and buy the bomb, don't you?
Absolutely, but it's the ground commander's initials, so ultimately that ground commander owns that bomb. I or the JTAC, whoever it is, will advise him, and obviously speak to the aircrew prior to that.
Which is quite right, given the closeness and the danger mission.
Absolutely, yeah.
We weren't inhibited in that sort of way.
Okay, so no restrictions other than...
It was up to you. It was up to you as someone who was calling in the jet strike. It was entirely up to you, whether you dropped it on yourself, the enemy, or somebody else. Entirely up to you. You made sure that you didn't put the pilot in jeopardy on his route in, and preferably on his route out either. But you couldn't promise anything. But we were fortunate. We weren't as inhibited as you are today. I flew 15 airborne combat missions with the strike aeroplanes because I knew the pilots. I didn't ask anybody if I could do it. As a company commander, I probably shouldn't have done it because if I'd have been killed, then the company wouldn't have had a company commander. I didn't bother to ask the colonel because the pilots and myself knew that we needed this sort of close support mission. And that's how it worked. We just did it. You made it up as you went along, really, but it was effective because of the goodwill and the camaraderie and the professionalism of the people involved. And it was a really integrated effort. It was surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, likewise, what you were saying with the air crews coming out on the ground with you and getting that side of things for yourself, as the company commander, being up there in the air and knowing, being able to see it from their point of view as well, I imagine.
Well, absolutely. I must admit, it perplexed my soldiers sometimes because they'd hear me talking from a jet in Arabic, which was unusual from a jet, to them by call sign, and they knew who I was.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I'm not over there where they thought I might be, I'm up here with the jets. So immediately, they knew I came from the RAF. Immediately, my reputation went sky high because there he is with us for me, flying the jet. Whoa, fantastic!
How did the logistics work on that then? Was you did you just happen to be back at Sultan at the time, or was that
You'd only do it occasionally.
Yeah.
You'd do it on a pre-planned attack mission. You'd range it. You'd get the aeroplanes to be on standby, and if the situation was a series of incomers, for example, and you knew the pattern, it would last about 3 hours probably. So you had time to get to Salalah. So we'd call in a helicopter, which was on its way in for resupply purposes. He'd dodge in, pick you up, take you straight to Salalah. You'd land on the runway at the side of the aeroplane, jump in. I was bang seat qualified and up to date with safety procedures and everything. Jump straight in, take off, and come up in radio silence because there was a listening trawler from our hostile friends reporting what was going on and where we were, so they knew if the airplane were airborne. So you were in a hostile environment. But we'd come up in silence, pull in towards the position, call guns tight for the artillery and mortars on the position so we didn't have an accidental blue on blue, and go straight in on a first pass attack, which worked like a charm a couple of times, and then they got used to it. But we got to the point where we were coming in on Upper Wadi, very low level, tip in, you know where they are, and there ahead of you is a mortar team setting up to fire at your position. Joy of joys, you got them. You know, number 2 comes in behind you and pastes it, you've gone over the top, you're looking, you come back in again and fire the rest of the rockets. Great, good day.
And that's so the Strike Master aircraft you were flying in, essentially the rockets, it was almost you using that aircraft like a rifle. You know, you had to point it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we did just that because it had 2 7.62 Jimpies as well.
Right.
So you'd fly it like a sniper rifle, or could direct it like a sniper rifle. But the rockets were pseudo rockets. They were designed to be launched at a 45-degree dive, and all the calculations and the sighting was geared for that. But on the day, you frequently couldn't get to that precision. So, for example, on occasions, we'd fly at very low level and come in a slight climb and attack something like that. And if you released the rockets then, fine, a marker rocket, but if you salvoed all the rockets, the kinetic energy transfer was such that the aircraft would nearly fall out of the sky. You were already at low level. Desperate stuff. And the aeroplane didn't have a lot of power. So it would stagger itself out of that and go back, and we'd look at it from upside down. And the number 2 aeroplane would come in behind you and put his rockets exactly where you'd put yours.
Yeah, right.
He would also then nearly stagger him way into the ground and have to fly. So, you know, it was very, there were no books that told you how to do this, either from a pilot's point of view or from the ground.
Couldn't do it.
Well, they'd have said no. Yeah, exactly.
I imagine there would have been quite a few glances between you and the pilot, sort of, you know, no words, but just like that, knowing, look, like, we got through that one.
Yeah, but again, there's this absolute trust because you knew each other, because you drank together, you ate together, you went out on patrol together, you flew together. There was huge trust and great camaraderie. And you knew very well. I mean, there have been occasions when the pilot would tell me, right, I'm going to put on a marker rocket, and he'd be on his way down. I'd be looking through the sight and say, you've got it wrong, give me the aeroplane. And he'd put him onto the right cave because I'd been there on the ground and you'd know it. You know, it was an astonishing set of circumstances, frankly. Yeah. However, that was Operation Simba. Yeah. Up on the Yemen border, 70 miles from Salalah.
Oh, right.
And completely surrounded by the enemy. We were absolutely on our own. And so it was a battalion deployment with infiltration, night attacks, people coming in, turning our claymores round so when you fired them, they
Really?
fired at you. Yeah, and they were very, very good, these guys. And I don't remember, on the platoon location I was on, which was the one nearest the Yemen border, a small defensive position really. When we got incomers, hardly any fell outside the perimeter.
Very accurate.
They were stunningly accurate, very competent indeed. I wish we had Mortimer that good.
What was that, 82 mil?
They used the 82 mil, but of course the advantage of the 82 mil, and one reason why it is 82, is that it fires 81 and 3-inch ammunition.
Yeah, they could fire our rounds, but we can't use theirs, did it?
Exactly. I mean, when I got hit, it was an 82. My bunker got 3 direct hits, one after the other. And the third one managed to come through and go off about 4 feet away. But I was behind a pillar which was holding up the roof. The pillar made of stone and ammunition boxes and so on. But it was pretty deafening. And the thing that I didn't know, and nobody had ever explained to me, is that when you're that close to an explosion, it sucks all the oxygen out of the air. So you're being sick and disorientated because you can't breathe. And then you can't breathe, you can't talk.
Yeah.
I was trying to talk to a jet strike, and my preoccupation was not leaving the pilot in mid-air over enemy territory with nobody to hit and not knowing what to do. I was not answering what he was asking.
Yeah.
It wasn't till later I realised that actually I'd received slight shrapnel wounds and it wasn't very serious. I had to go off and get stitched up, but you don't think about it at that stage because you're very busy. And you're busy talking to your guys on the ground who've got machine gun fire going on, etc., etc. But Simba was an extraordinarily busy place. We had incomers nearly every day, and therefore you can't keep up that pace. So we rotated, and my company redeployed to become the Brigade Reserve at Salalah, down at the army camp next to RAF Salalah.
Yeah.
And then I saw quite a lot of the RAF Regiment and supported what they were doing by working beyond them up into the mountains.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed that and would like to hear more, then please tune in with Wing Commander Jones in episode 3, Pressure Near the Yemen Border.